Welcome back, everyone. I know you all love royal history and those larger-than-life monarchs, but today we're diving into some fascinating source material all about ancient Greece. Now, you might be thinking, ancient Greece? What's that got to do with kings and queens? But stick with me, because even though Greece wasn't known for having, sprawling kingdoms, it did have powerful figures and systems of government that surprisingly laid the groundwork for much of European history and culture.
Right. We often think of ancient Greece and monarchies as separate things,
Yeah.
but there are some intriguing connections there.
Definitely. It all starts with these things called city-states,
Hmm.
almost like mini kingdoms all over the place. Imagine a map dotted with all these independent cities,
Uh-huh.
each with its own ruler laws and even armies. It's a totally different setup than, those massive kingdoms we usually picture.
And these city-states were shaped by Greece's unique geography.
Oh, absolutely.
You've got mountains, islands, harbors,
Right.
all these natural barriers making it tough to unify the region under one powerful king.
So basically, it was easier to just rule your own little corner of the world than try to conquer your neighbor who's perched on top of a mountain or across a raging river.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this isolation helped foster a lot of innovation and diversity in ancient Greece. But one thing that was common across many city-states was the practice of slavery.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a dark thread that runs through a lot of ancient history. How does slavery factor into the power dynamics of these city-states?
Well, it's important to understand that citizenship in these city-states was tied to freedom and owning slaves. Only citizens could participate in politics.
Okay.
What the Greeks called politica, which is actually where we get our word politics from.
So the very concept of politics as we know it is rooted in these ancient Greek city-states. That's amazing.
It really is. And of all these city-states, two emerged as the most powerful and influential: Athens and Sparta. They represent two very different approaches to power and governance, and their rivalry would shape the course of Greek history.
Okay, so Athens and Sparta. Two names everyone's heard of. But before we get into their epic rivalry, let's go back to their origins. Athens, for example, has this crazy founding myth involving a creature that's half man, half serpent.
That's right, Cecrops. Legend has it he was the first king of Athens, way back around 1500 BCE. Of course, it's a myth, but it speaks to the way the ancient Greeks saw their origins.
Yeah.
A blend of the human and the divine.
So they went from a serpent king to eventually becoming the birthplace of democracy.
That's quite a leap. How did that transition even happen?
It wasn't a smooth or quick process.
Right.
After Cecrops, Athens had a series of kings, but there was this pivotal moment around 1070 BCE involving King Codrus. An oracle prophesied that Athens would only be saved from invaders if their king died.
Talk about a tough break. So what did Codrus do? Did he just surrender and let himself be captured?
No, he disguised himself as a peasant and deliberately provoked the enemy, leading to his own death. This act of self-sacrifice so moved the Athenians that they decided to abolish the monarchy altogether, believing no one could ever live up to Codrus's bravery. Wow, that's some serious dedication to your city. But if they got rid of kings who took over, did they just start voting right then and there?
Not quite. They established a system of archons,
Archons.
essentially governors who held power for a limited time. But the first archons were still mainly from noble families.
Oh, so the power struggles continued even without a king.
Right,
Yeah.
leading to tension between the elites and the common people.
Yeah, sounds like human nature to me.
Indeed. In 621 BCE, they brought in Draco to codify Athenian law. You've probably heard the phrase draconian laws.
Yeah.
And for good reason. His punishments were notoriously harsh,
Right.
even for minor offenses.
Yeah, so not exactly the kind of leader you'd want to invite over for dinner, but his laws did highlight a need for change.
Absolutely. Draco's laws were so unpopular that they led to even more unrest, and that's where Solon comes in. A wise Athenian appointed archon in 594 BCE. He's often considered one of the founding fathers of Athenian democracy, because he understood that true stability came from addressing social and economic inequalities.
Okay, so Solon sounds like a game changer. What were some of his big moves? Did he just give everyone the right to vote and call it a day?
He didn't go that far,
Okay.
but he did implement some radical reforms for the time. He abolished debt slavery, reformed the economy, and even encouraged skilled foreigners to immigrate to Athens.
Smart move. But what about political power? Did he give the common people a say in government?
He did, and this is where things get interesting.
Okay.
For those who love studying how societies evolve, Solon created a system called timocratia. basically dividing citizens into 4 classes based on wealth.
So the richer you were, the more political clout you had. Doesn't sound very democratic to me.
True, but it was a huge step away from the old aristocratic system.
Okay.
Under Solon's reforms, even the poorest citizens could participate in the assembly and serve on juries. Remember, this is 594 BCE.
Right.
Giving ordinary people a voice in government was practically unheard of.
So Solon's reforms were a step towards democracy, but not the full picture. What happened next? Did his changes stick?
They laid the groundwork for what was to come, but Athenian society was still far from stable. After Solon, a figure named Pisistratus seized power.
Okay.
He was technically a tyrant, meaning he ruled without being elected, but he was a clever one.
A popular tyrant. Now that's an interesting combination. How did he manage that?
He appealed to the common people by implementing policies that benefited them directly,
Okay.
like land redistribution and public works projects. He also invested in Athenian culture and secured trade routes, boosting the city's economy.
So a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah, good and bad all rolled into one.
What happened after Pisistratus? Did his sons inherit the tyrant throne?
They tried, but they were eventually overthrown. And that's when a truly remarkable figure steps onto the stage of history. Cleisthenes. He's the one who's credited with establishing what we now recognize as Athenian democracy.
Okay, Cleisthenes the reformer. What were his big ideas? How did he finally make democracy a reality in Athens?
Cleisthenes understood that true democracy was more than just giving people a voice. It was about preventing anyone from gaining too much power.
Okay.
So he restructured Athenian society to break up old tribal loyalties and replace them with new geographically based units.
So he was all about mixing things up and preventing any one group from dominating.
Exactly. And he introduced 2 radical ideas.
Okay.
A lottery system for choosing government officials and something called ostracism.
Ostracism, like being voted off the island.
Exactly. Once a year, citizens could vote to exile someone they deemed a threat to democracy. A powerful way to keep ambitious individuals in check.
Wow, Athenian democracy sounds like a wild ride. But while all this was going on, what was happening in other parts of the world?
Well, at roughly the same time that Cleisthenes was introducing democracy in Athens, China was consolidating power under the Zhou dynasty's feudal system. 2 very different approaches to power and governance emerging around the same time.
It's amazing how different cultures tackled these challenges in such different ways. But how much of this can we chalk up to geography?
Geography plays a huge role. Athens, with its reliance on sea trade and surrounded by those natural barriers, had a very different outlook than China.
Right.
With its vast agricultural plains that favored a more centralized system, these differences shaped their destinies.
So we've gone from serpent kings to groundbreaking reforms. It's incredible to see how those early power struggles in Athens laid the foundation for what we now call democracy.
And here's what's fascinating. Athenian democracy, for all its imperfections, planted seeds that would influence European thought for centuries. How those ideas evolved and eventually shaped the monarchies of Europe. Well, that's a story for the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into ancient Greece. Last time we left off with Athens on the verge of a golden age, having just established this radical new system of democracy. But I'm curious, how did this Athenian democracy actually work in practice? It all sounds good in theory, but how did they handle things like elections laws, actually running a city-state?
Well, Athenian democracy was a complex system with checks and balances designed to prevent any one person or group from gaining too much power.
So it wasn't as simple as just everyone getting together and voting on everything.
Not at all. The most important institution was the assembly, or ecclesia.
Okay.
This is where all adult male citizens could gather to debate and vote on laws, declare war, elect officials.
Wait, all citizens? That must have been some massive gathering. How do they even fit everyone in one place?
It could be quite a spectacle. The assembly often met on a hill called the Pnyx, which could accommodate thousands of people.
Wow, talk about direct democracy. But if everyone got to vote on everything, wouldn't it have been total chaos?
To keep things organized, the assembly was presided over by a group of 500 citizens chosen by lottery called the Boule.
The Boule, what did they do exactly?
Think of them as a steering committee.
Okay.
They set the agenda for the assembly drafted laws and oversaw the day-to-day administration of the city. They served for 1-year terms, and no citizen could serve on the Boule more than twice in their lifetime.
Interesting. So they had term limits to prevent anyone from holding on to power for too long. But how did they make sure the Boule was actually doing a good job? Who was keeping them accountable?
Well, remember those 10 Athenian tribes that Cleisthenes created?
Uh-huh.
Each tribe sent 50 representatives to the Boule. Each month, one of the tribes would take a leading role, providing a president and a committee to manage the Boule's business.
So it's like a rotating presidency with each tribe getting their turn to run the show.
Yeah.
That's a clever way to ensure representation and balance. But who actually put the laws and decisions made by the assembly and the Boule into action?
That was the job of the magistrates. These were elected officials responsible for specific areas of government,
Okay.
like finance, military affairs, public works.
So Athenian democracy had this intricate web of institutions and officials all designed to make sure power was distributed. But what about their legal system? How did they ensure justice was served?
The Athenian legal system was unique. Most cases were tried before juries of citizens, often hundreds of them.
Hundreds of jurors. Why so many? That seems a bit excessive, doesn't it?
The Athenians believed that large juries were less likely to be swayed by bribes or intimidation. It was their way of safeguarding against corruption.
That makes sense. So how did these trials actually work? Did they have lawyers and judges like we do today?
Not exactly. There were no professional lawyers in Athens. Citizens had to represent themselves or rely on friends or family to speak for them.
Hmm.
And instead of a judge, the jury acted as both judge and jury, deciding both guilt or innocence and the appropriate punishment.
Wow. That's a lot of responsibility for ordinary citizens.
Yeah.
This whole system of citizen participation, it must have had a huge impact on Athenian society as a whole.
Absolutely. Athenian democracy fostered a vibrant culture of civic engagement and political debate. Citizens were expected to be informed and participate in the decision-making process. It wasn't just about casting a vote every few years.
Yeah.
It was about being actively involved in the life of the city-state.
The idea of citizens being so involved in their government is really inspiring. And this culture of engagement didn't stop at politics, did it? Athens became a real hub of intellectual and artistic activity.
Exactly. Athens during this period produced some of the greatest philosophers, playwrights, and artists in history. Think Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Euripides.
Wow.
They all flourished in this environment of intellectual freedom and debate.
It's incredible how this system of government helped foster such creative and innovative society. But this flowering of Athenian culture, didn't it coincide with a period of military expansion and empire building?
You're right. As Athenian democracy matured, Athens also emerged as a major power in the Aegean Sea.
Okay.
This was driven by trade population growth and the need to secure resources. Athens formed an alliance with other city-states known as the Delian League, which eventually evolved into something more like an Athenian empire.
So they started out as a defensive alliance, but it eventually morphed into something more controlling, with Athens calling the shots.
That's essentially what happened. Athens used its naval power and wealth to exert influence over the other members of the League, demanding tribute and imposing its will on its allies.
Right.
It's a classic example of how power, even in a democracy, can be a corrupting force.
It's a timeless lesson, isn't it? Power can change even the best of intentions. But this Athenian empire, it didn't last forever, did it?
No, it didn't. As Athens grew more powerful, it inevitably came into conflict with another rising power.
Sparta.
Ah, yes. Athens and Sparta. Now, that's a rivalry for the ages. Two very different approaches to power and society going head-to-head. Exactly. These two city-states represented very different visions of Greece. Athens, with its democracy, its focus on trade and naval power, its vibrant cultural life, was the antithesis of Sparta.
So what was Sparta all about then? Were they just a bunch of muscle-bound warriors with no appreciation for art or philosophy?
Sparta was a militaristic society obsessed with discipline and martial prowess.
Okay.
From childhood, Spartan boys were trained for war, living in communal barracks and enduring harsh physical challenges. Individuality was suppressed in favor of collective obedience and conformity.
It sounds like a pretty intense place to grow up. No wonder they were such fierce warriors. So you have these two polar opposites, Athens, the champion of democracy and intellectual freedom,
Right.
and Sparta, the embodiment of military discipline and conformity. It sounds like a clash was inevitable.
And clash they did,
Yeah.
in a series of devastating wars known as the Peloponnesian Wars. These wars dragged on for decades, draining both city-states of their resources and manpower.
So who won in the end?
Ultimately, Sparta emerged victorious thanks, in part, to its superior land army and its alliance with Persia. But the victory came at a great cost. The Peloponnesian Wars left Greece weakened and divided, paving the way for its eventual conquest by Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great.
So even though Sparta won, They didn't really win in the end. It's like they both lost by destroying each other.
That's a good way to put it. The Peloponnesian Wars marked the end of the golden age of Greece. But before we move on to the rise of Macedon, I think it's important to circle back to Athenian democracy.
Okay.
Despite its flaws and its eventual demise, it left behind a legacy that would inspire people for centuries to come.
Absolutely. The Athenian experiment in democracy, even though it didn't last forever, planted the seeds for ideas that would resonate throughout history. The concepts of individual rights, popular sovereignty, the rule of law, they all have their roots in ancient Athens.
Exactly. The Athenian example showed the world that ordinary people, given the opportunity, could govern themselves and create a vibrant and innovative society. And that idea, the power of the people, would prove to be a powerful and enduring force.
It's fascinating to see how these ideas that were born in a small city-state thousands of years ago continue to influence us today. But what about those serpent men you mentioned earlier? What role did those mythical creatures play in all of this?
Yes, Cecrops and his serpentine origins.
Right.
While we may never know for sure if such a creature truly existed, the myth serves as a reminder of the power of storytelling and our enduring fascination with the origins of civilization.
So even in our deep dive into history, we find ourselves grappling with myth and legend. It seems there's always more to uncover, more layers to peel back.
Indeed. That's what makes the study of history so endlessly fascinating. It's a journey of discovery, a quest to understand the forces that have shaped our world and ourselves.
Well said. But before we get too philosophical, let's shift our focus to the aftermath of the Peloponnesian Wars and the rise of a new power in Greece, Macedon. Welcome back to our deep dive into ancient Greece. Last time we left off with Greece kind of in a tough spot, weakened and divided after those brutal Peloponnesian Wars. So who stepped into that power vacuum?
That's when we see the rise of a kingdom to the north, Macedon.
Macedon.
Yeah.
Weren't they considered a bit of a backwater compared to sophisticated city-states like Athens?
They were often overlooked, but Macedon had been quietly gaining strength, and under the leadership of King Philip II, they became a force to be reckoned with.
King Philip II. Now, there's a name that sends chills down the spines of history buffs. What was his secret? How did he turn Macedon into such a powerhouse?
Well, Philip II was a brilliant military strategist and a master politician. He recognized that the Macedonian army needed a serious upgrade, so he modernized their tactics and weaponry, introducing the famous Macedonian phalanx.
The phalanx, those tightly packed formations of soldiers with those super long spears, right?
Exactly. It was incredibly effective. Imagine a wall of shields and spears advancing on the enemy, practically unstoppable. Philip also knew how to play the political game. He exploited the divisions between the Greek city-states, forging alliances and weakening their resistance.
So he was a master divide and conquer.
Precisely. And by 338 BCE, he had achieved his goal, uniting most of Greece under Macedonian rule after a decisive victory at the Battle of Chaeronea.
Wow. So this relatively unknown kingdom from the north ended up conquering those mighty Greek city-states. That's a real twist in the tale. But what about Philip's son, Alexander? Wasn't he the one who really took the Macedonian Empire to the next level?
Yes. Alexander the Great, one of the most legendary figures in history. He inherited his father's ambition and military genius, but he took it to extraordinary heights.
Alexander the Great. Conqueror king legend. Where do we even begin with a figure like that?
Well, his conquest started when he was just 20 years old, shortly after he became king. He led his Macedonian army on an epic campaign eastward, sweeping through Persia, Egypt, and even reaching India.
India? That's mind-blowing. How did he manage to conquer such vast territories with what I'm guessing was a relatively small army?
Well, Alexander was a brilliant military tactician. He was known for his daring strategies and his ability to inspire his troops, but he was also a shrewd ruler. He understood that to maintain control of such a vast empire, he needed to win over the people he conquered.
So it wasn't just about brute force. He had to be smart about it.
Exactly. He incorporated conquered peoples into his army and administration, fostering a sense of loyalty and cooperation.
What a fascinating approach. But what was driving him? Was it just a lust for power and glory?
Historians have debated that question for centuries. Alexander was certainly ambitious, but he also seems to have been driven by a vision of a unified world, a cosmopolitan empire, where Greek culture and ideas could spread and flourish alongside those of other civilizations.
So he wasn't just a conqueror. He was a cultural ambassador,
Yeah.
in a way, spreading Greek influence throughout the ancient world. That adds a whole new dimension to his story. But what about his legacy? What impact did his conquests have on the course of history?
Well, Alexander's empire, though short-lived, had a profound impact. His conquests spread Greek culture, language, and ideas across vast territories, ushering in a new era known as the Hellenistic period.
The Hellenistic period. It's like a fusion of Greek and Eastern influences, right?
Precisely. Alexander's conquests opened up new trade routes and led to a vibrant exchange of ideas and artistic styles between the East and the West. This fusion of cultures had a lasting impact on the development of Western civilization.
So even though Alexander's empire crumbled after his death, his legacy lived on through the spread of Hellenistic culture. That's a pretty incredible legacy. We started with these small independent city-states in Greece, and through all these twists and turns, we've seen the birth of democracy, the rise of Macedon, and the creation of this massive empire spanning continents.
And remember, this journey through ancient Greece isn't just about kings and battles. It's about those big ideas, the struggle for freedom, the impact of cultural exchange. These themes continue to resonate today, reminding us that the past is never truly past. It shapes who we are and the world we live in.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into ancient Greece, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to ponder?
Think about those radical ideas about individual rights and the power of the people. They didn't originate in a palace. They were born in the bustling marketplace and the crowded assembly of ancient Athens.
What a powerful thought. Thanks for joining us on this epic journey through ancient Greece. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those history books open.